I never thought I'd become invisible in my own home. For 12 years, I lived in Gregory Whitaker's house like a ghost, cooking meals that went half-eaten, tending a garden no one noticed, and caring for a man whose children treated me like hired help they couldn't fire. When Gregory died 3 years ago, Eli and Sophie disappeared from my life as completely as morning fog. No calls, no visits, no acknowledgment that I'd spent his final months holding his hand through chemotherapy and sleepless nights. They took what they wanted from his study and left me with silence. But yesterday, Eli's car pulled into the driveway for the first time since the funeral. What could possibly bring them back after all this time? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I was 57 years old when I first realized that love could make you disappear. Not the dramatic kind of disappearing you see in movies, where someone vanishes in a puff of smoke or walks into the sunset, never to return. This was slower, more insidious, the kind where you fade away one small compromise at a time until you look in the mirror and wonder who's staring back. The Bronze Teaching Award still sat on my dresser, though I'd retired from Lincoln High School over a decade ago. Outstanding Educator, 2009, it read. Back when I was Lorraine Mitchell, and my biggest worry was whether Tommy Rodriguez would pass his senior art project. I'd taught high school art for 23 years, had my own little apartment with plants that I somehow managed to keep alive, and a routine that belonged entirely to me. Friday evenings meant wine and a good book. Saturdays were for the farmer's market and puttering in my small garden. Sundays I'd drive to my sister's house in Naperville, and we'd make elaborate dinners and complain about our mother's passive-aggressive phone calls. That was before Gregory. I met him at Helen Kowalski's retirement party. She'd been the school librarian for 37 years and insisted on throwing herself a farewell bash at the country club. Gregory was there because his real estate company had donated the silent auction prizes, and I was there because Helen had been my coffee companion for the better part of 2 decades. He was tall, silver-haired, and had the kind of steady presence that made you feel like everything would work out fine. When he asked me to dance to The Way You Look Tonight, I felt 16 again. "You're not from around here," he said, and I laughed because I'd lived in Riverside for 15 years. "Born and raised in Michigan," I told him, "but I've been teaching at Lincoln since 1986. "Art teacher? How did you know?" He gestured toward my hands, which were permanently stained with traces of paint under my fingernails, despite my best efforts with pumice stones. "My late wife was an artist, too. She always had those little paint marks." The mention of his late wife should have been a red flag, but instead it felt like an invitation into something deeper. Margaret had died of breast cancer 2 years earlier, leaving Gregory with 2 teenagers in a house that echoed with memories. Eli was 17, already accepted to Northwestern, counting down the days until he could leave for college. Sophie was 15, angry at the world, and particularly angry at the idea that life could continue without her mother. "They're good kids," Gregory told me on our 3rd date, over dinner at a quiet Italian place downtown. "They just need time. Time." It seemed reasonable then. I imagined cozy family dinners, maybe teaching Sophie some basic art techniques, helping Eli with his college application essays. I pictured myself as the gentle presence who would help heal their grief, not replace their mother, but offer something different. Stability, warmth, understanding. I was so naive. Gregory proposed to me 6 months later on a snowy January evening, in his living room, The house was a sprawling colonial in Riverside's historic district, with built-in bookshelves and hardwood floors that creaked with character. The engagement ring was his grandmother's, a simple solitaire that caught the light from the fireplace. Eli was upstairs with his headphones on, and Sophie was at a friend's house. It felt private and perfect. "I know this might seem fast," Gregory said, getting down on one knee beside the coffee table where I'd been grading student portfolios. "But I'm 56 years old, Lorraine. I know what I want." What he wanted, it turned out, was someone to fill the empty spaces Margaret had left behind. Not just the obvious ones: the other side of the bed, the passenger seat in his car, the second place setting at dinner, but the invisible work that holds a household together, remembering when the dentist appointments were scheduled, knowing which grocery store had the best produce, noticing when the furnace filter needed changing. Said yes because I loved him, and because I thought love would be enough to bridge the distance between his children and me. I said yes because at 49 I was tired of coming home to an empty apartment and heating up lean cuisine dinners for one. I said yes because Gregory made me feel wanted in a way I hadn't experienced since my college boyfriend, before I learned that wanting someone and truly seeing them were two entirely different things. The wedding was small, just immediate family and a few close friends at the courthouse, followed by dinner at Gregory's country club. Eli wore a suit that was slightly too small and smiled politely for photos, but his eyes held the distant look of someone enduring a necessary ordeal. Sophie wore black, which Gregory pretended not to notice, and spent most of the reception texting on her phone. "Give them time," Gregory whispered to me during our first dance. "They'll come around." But time, I learned, could calcify resentment just as easily as it could heal wounds. Moving into the Whitaker house meant leaving behind my apartment, my independence, and most of my furniture. Gregory's house was already furnished with Margaret's. Careful choices. A cream-colored sofa that showed every speck of dust, antique side tables that required special polish, and family photos in silver frames on every surface. The master bedroom still held traces of her perfume in the walk-in closet, and her jewelry box sat untouched on the dresser. "We should redecorate," I suggested gently one evening, about a month after the wedding. "Make it feel like ours." Gregory looked up from his newspaper with a startled expression, as if I'd suggested burning the house down. "The kids are already dealing with so much change," he said. "Maybe we should wait until they're both in college." So I waited. I learned to navigate around Margaret's ghost, to cook in her kitchen using her recipes, to sleep in her bed, and pretend I didn't notice when Gregory sometimes whispered her name in his sleep. I kept my teaching award and a few personal photos on the nightstand on my side of the bed. Small claims to territory in a house that never quite felt like home. Eli left for Northwestern that fall, and the house grew quieter. Sophie's hostility shifted from active antagonism to cold politeness. She'd say please and thank you when I made her lunch or drove her to soccer practice, but the words felt rehearsed, empty of any genuine warmth. When her friends came over, she'd introduce me as my dad's wife, Lorraine. Never as her stepmother, never with any indication that I held any meaningful place in her life. "She's warming up to you," Gregory would say, choosing to interpret Sophie's basic civility as progress. I can tell. But I could tell too, and what I saw was a 15-year-old girl who'd learned to tolerate my presence while waiting for me to prove temporary. She was polite to the mailman too, but that didn't make him family. The years passed in a quiet rhythm of small compromises and swallowed disappointments. I retired from teaching when Gregory suggested I might enjoy having more time at home. I Gave up my Thursday evening pottery class because it conflicted with Sophie's soccer games. I learned to make Gregory's coffee exactly the way Margaret had. 2 sugars, a splash of cream, and pretended not to notice when he sometimes called me by her name first thing in the morning. Eli visited occasionally during college breaks. Always polite but distant, like an acquaintance, fulfilling a social obligation. He'd thank me for dinner and ask how I was doing with the kind of surface-level interest you might show your Uber driver. Sophie graduated high school and went to DePaul, majoring in communications with dreams of becoming a social media influencer. She'd post photos from family gatherings that somehow managed to crop me out entirely, or included me only as a partial shadow at the edge of the frame. "Look at this sweet throwback." She'd caption a photo of her and Gregory at her high school graduation, taken right after a family dinner where I'd spent 3 hours cooking her favorite meal. In the photo, you could see just my hand passing a dinner roll in the background, disembodied and easily ignored. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that love wasn't about recognition or gratitude, that I was building something meaningful with Gregory, even if his children couldn't see it. I told myself that patience was a virtue, that kindness was its own reward, that I was the bigger person for not demanding acknowledgment. But late at night, when Gregory was asleep beside me, and the house was quiet, I'd sometimes lie awake and wonder what had happened to the woman who'd won teaching awards and maintained her own household and never felt invisible. I'd think about my old apartment, with its morning light streaming through windows I'd chosen myself, and wonder if I'd traded too much for the promise of love. The first signs of Gregory's illness appeared when he was 64. He'd always been a careful eater, but he started losing weight without trying. He'd complain of stomach pain after meals, then brush off my suggestions to see a doctor. "It's probably just stress from the Hoffman development," he'd say, or, "I'm getting older, Lorraine. Things hurt sometimes." When he finally agreed to see Dr. Peterson, it was only because I'd made the appointment myself and threatened to drive him there, whether he liked it or not. That was the first time in our marriage I'd put my foot down about anything. And the surprise in Gregory's eyes made me realize how thoroughly I'd learned to defer to his preferences. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday afternoon in March: pancreatic cancer. Stage 3. Dr. Peterson delivered the news with professional compassion, but I could see in his eyes what he couldn't say directly, that Gregory's time was measured in months, not years. Gregory took the news with the same steady composure he brought to everything else. He asked practical questions about treatment options and timelines, took notes in his careful handwriting, and scheduled follow-up appointments with the same methodical approach he'd used for real estate contracts. I called Eli and Sophie from the hospital parking lot while Gregory was scheduling his first oncology appointment. Eli was in his final year at Northwestern, busy with job interviews and senior projects. Sophie was finishing her sophomore year at DePaul, deeply involved in her sorority and a new relationship with a boy named Chad, who appeared in every other Instagram post. "How bad is it?" Eli asked, his voice flat and practical. "Dr. Peterson says we'll know more after the first round of tests," I told him, sitting in Gregory's Honda Civic with the windows down because I couldn't seem to catch my breath. "But it's serious, Eli. He'll need treatment and recovery time, and—" "I can come home this weekend," Eli said. Sophie probably should too. They came that first weekend. They sat in the living room while Gregory explained his treatment plan, nodded at appropriate moments, and asked the right questions. But I could see them calculating already how much time they'd need to take off from their lives, how much disruption this would cause, how to manage a crisis that felt both urgent and abstract. "We'll figure it out," Sophie said, hugging Gregory. "Goodbye Sunday evening." "Dad, you're going to beat this." But as she hugged him, I caught her eye over his shoulder, and what I saw there wasn't hope or determination. It was the look of someone already beginning to grieve, already stepping back to protect herself from too much pain. Gregory's illness lasted 18 months. 18 months of chemotherapy treatments and radiation appointments. Of good days, when he felt strong enough to work in his study, and bad days, when he couldn't keep down more than ginger ale and crackers. 18 months of learning to read the subtle signs of his discomfort, of sleeping lightly so I could wake up when he needed help, getting to the bathroom at 3 a.m. Eli visited when he could, usually for a long weekend every few months. He'd graduated and taken a job as a financial analyst in Chicago, a 40-minute drive that might as well have been across the country for how often he made it. Sophie came home more frequently, but her visits felt performative, orchestrated for social media as much as genuine concern. She'd post photos of herself holding Gregory's hand with captions about family strength and cherishing every moment, but then spend most of her visit on her phone, texting with friends or updating her Instagram stories. I became Gregory's primary caretaker by default, not by explicit discussion, but through the gradual accumulation of daily necessities. I drove him to appointments because I had more flexibility in my schedule. I learned to manage his medications because I was the one home when the pharmacy called. I researched clinical trials and alternative treatments because the quiet evening hours gave me time to scour medical websites and cancer support forums. "You don't have to do all this," Gregory told me one evening as I helped him to bed after a particularly difficult day of chemotherapy. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and he'd lost so much weight that his wedding ring kept sliding around on his finger. "I want to," I said. And it was true. Not because I enjoyed watching him suffer, but because taking care of him felt like the most meaningful thing I'd done in years. It was tangible work with clear purpose, unlike the endless emotional labor of trying to win over his children or find my place in a house full of someone else's memories. Gregory died on a Thursday, morning in October, with me holding his hand and Sophie flying in from a sorority retreat in Wisconsin. Eli had been there the night before, but had gone home to shower and change clothes, planning to return by noon. The nurse said Gregory had been waiting for Sophie, that sometimes patients hold on until their loved ones arrive. I wanted to point out that I'd been there all along, through every sleepless night and difficult treatment, but it seemed petty and small to compete for Gregory's final moments. Instead, I held his hand and told him it was okay to let go, that Sophie was on her way, and he'd fought hard enough. He died peacefully, just as the morning light was streaming through the bedroom windows. I'd finally been allowed to redecorate the year before. Sophie arrived 20 minutes later, and her grief was raw and immediate, the kind of sobbing that comes from deep in the chest and can't be controlled or contained. I held her while she cried, this young woman who'd never quite accepted me but needed comfort from someone who understood her loss. For a few minutes, standing in that sunny bedroom where Gregory had just died, I thought maybe we'd finally found common ground in our shared grief. But grief, I learned, doesn't automatically create connection. It can just as easily build walls. The week after Gregory's funeral was a blur of casseroles from neighbors and paperwork that seemed to multiply overnight. I'd never realized how much bureaucracy surrounded death. Death certificates and insurance, claims, bank accounts that needed to be closed or transferred, subscriptions that needed to be canceled. Gregory had been methodical about his affairs, but even his careful organization couldn't eliminate the endless forms and phone calls. Eli took charge of the estate proceedings with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complex financial matters. He'd taken a week off work and approached Gregory's final arrangements like a project that needed to be completed on schedule. Sophie helped when she could, but her grief came in unpredictable waves that left her alternately furious and exhausted. "Dad would have hated all this fuss," she said on the third day, watching me sort through sympathy cards at the kitchen table. "He was so private. It was the first time she'd really talked to me since the funeral, and I looked up hopefully, thinking maybe shared sorrow would create an opening for real conversation." He was, I agreed. But I think he would have been touched by how many people cared about him. Sophie nodded absently, already reaching for her phone as it buzzed with another text message. The moment passed, and we returned to our separate islands of grief. Gregory's lawyer, Harold Brennan, scheduled a meeting for the following Tuesday to read the will. It felt oddly formal and old-fashioned, like something from a movie. But Harold had been Gregory's attorney for over 20 years and insisted on doing things properly. "There shouldn't be any surprises," Eli told me the night before the meeting. We were sitting in Gregory's study, surrounded by boxes of papers we'd been sorting. "Dad was pretty straightforward about his wishes." I nodded, though I realized I had no idea what those wishes actually were. Gregory and I had never had detailed conversations about inheritance or estate planning. I knew there were life insurance, policies, and retirement accounts, and I assumed the house would be mine since we'd been married for 12 years. Beyond that, I'd trusted Gregory to handle the details. Harold's office was downtown, in one of those old buildings with marble lobbies and brass elevators that spoke of established money and long-standing traditions. His secretary offered us coffee and led us into a conference room with windows overlooking the Chicago River. "I've known your father for a long time," Harold began, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he opened a manila folder. He was very thoughtful about his estate planning, especially after his diagnosis. The will itself was fairly straightforward. Gregory had left me the house and its contents, along with his personal belongings and half of his retirement accounts. Eli and Sophie would inherit the other half of the retirement money, plus his life insurance policies and his share in the real estate business. "It's generous," I said quietly, surprised by the scope of what Gregory had left me. The house alone was worth substantial money, and I'd expected him to leave it to his children. "Dad wanted to make sure you were taken care of," Sophie said, and for the first time since the funeral, her voice held something approaching warmth. But Harold wasn't finished. He pulled out another document, this one thicker, and bound with a vow. "Blue cover. There's also the matter of the trust fund," he said, consulting his notes. "Gregory established this about 10 years ago, when Eli was still in college. I'd heard mentions of a trust fund over the years, but Gregory had always been vague about the details. I'd assumed it was a college fund, or perhaps a small inheritance the children would receive when they turned 30. Harold opened the trust document and began to read. The fund contained nearly $800,000, money Gregory had accumulated through real estate investments and careful saving over the years. It was designated for Eli and Sophie, to be distributed when they both reached the age of 30 or upon Gregory's death, whichever came later. "Since Sophie is only 28, Harold continued, the funds will remain in trust until her 30th birthday." Eli leaned forward in his chair. "But that's 2 years from now. Is there any way to access the money earlier?" Harold flipped through several pages, running his finger down columns of legal text. "There is a provision for early distribution in cases of emergency or significant financial need, but it requires approval from the trustee." "Who's the trustee?" Sophie asked. Harold looked up from the document, his expression neutral but somehow significant. "Your father originally named your mother, Margaret, as the primary trustee, with himself as backup. After Margaret's death, he updated the designation." The room fell quiet. I could hear the muffled sounds of traffic from the street below and the quiet hum of the office ventilation system. "The current trustee," Harold continued, "is Lorraine." I felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Eli and Sophie both turned to stare at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. Surprise, confusion, and something that might have been calculation. "I don't understand," I said. "Gregory never mentioned this to me." "The trust documents were updated about 5 years ago," Harold explained, consulting his papers again. "Gregory felt that since you were his wife and had been closely involved in family financial matters, you would be the most appropriate person to oversee the fund." But I hadn't been closely involved in family financial matters. Gregory had always handled the investments and major financial decisions, consulting me only about household expenses and routine bills. This felt like a responsibility I was unprepared for and hadn't asked for. "What exactly does that mean?" Eli asked, his voice carefully controlled. "What kind of approval are we talking about?" Harold explained the technical details, but they boiled down to something quite simple. If Eli or Sophie wanted to access the trust fund money before Sophie's 30th birthday, they would need my written consent. The fund had specific provisions about legitimate financial emergencies, but the final decision rested with the trustee, with me. "It's really just a formality," Harold assured us. "The money is intended for Eli and Sophie eventually. The trustee provision is mainly to prevent impulsive spending or financial mismanagement." After the meeting, we stood on the sidewalk outside Harold's building, the October wind whipping off the river and cutting through our coats. Neither Eli nor Sophie spoke for several minutes, and I could practically see them processing this unexpected development. "Well," Eli finally said, "I guess we should have lunch and talk about this." We went to a quiet restaurant near Harold's office, the kind of place with white tablecloths and servers who never hurried you along. Eli ordered wine, though it was barely past noon, and Sophie pushed her salad around her plate without eating much. "I have to say, this is kind of awkward," Sophie began, not quite meeting my eyes. "I mean, it's not that we don't trust you or anything, but you barely know me," I finished for her. "And I barely know you." The honesty seemed to surprise them both. For 12 years, we'd all pretended that politeness was the same as relationship, that Gregory's love for me would somehow translate into familial connection with his children. But sitting in that restaurant, with Gregory's legacy literally resting in my hands, the pretense felt impossible to maintain. "Dad must have had his reasons," Eli said diplomatically. "He was always careful about financial planning." I thought about Gregory's reasoning, trying to understand why he'd placed me in this position without discussing it with me first. Was it an oversight? Something he'd intended to change but never got around to? Or had it been deliberate, a way of ensuring that his children would have to maintain some connection with me after his death? "Do either of you need the money right now?" I asked. "I mean, is this about an emergency or something urgent?" They exchanged glances across the table, the kind of wordless communication that comes from a lifetime of shared history I'd never been part of. "Not exactly an emergency," Eli said carefully. "But I've been looking at investment opportunities, and having access to the funds would give me more flexibility." Sophie nodded. And I'm trying to build my brand as an influencer. There are some marketing opportunities that require upfront investment, and it would be amazing to have access to that money now, instead of waiting 2 years. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Their requests sounded reasonable on the surface, but something about the conversation felt rehearsed, as if they'd discussed this possibility before coming to the lawyer's office. I wondered how long they'd known about the trust fund provisions, whether Gregory had told them about my role as trustee. "I need to think about this," I said. "It's a big responsibility, and I want to make sure I'm doing what Gregory would have wanted." "Of course," Sophie said quickly. "We totally understand. Take all the time you need." But I could see the impatience in Eli's eyes, the barely concealed frustration at having to ask permission for what he considered rightfully his. I could see Sophie calculating how much charm and persuasion it might take to get me to sign whatever papers would release the money. We finished lunch with awkward small talk about Sophie's social media career and Eli's work in Chicago. They both promised to stay in touch, to visit soon, to include me in family gatherings that had never quite included me before. But their promises felt hollow, motivated by necessity rather than genuine affection. After they left, I sat in my car in the restaurant parking lot for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. For 12 years, I'd been the outsider in Gregory's family, tolerated but never truly welcomed. Now, suddenly, I held something they wanted, something they needed me to approve. The irony wasn't lost on me. Gregory had spent our entire marriage avoiding confrontation, smoothing over the tensions between his children and me with platitudes about time and patience. But in death, he'd created a situation that forced us all to confront the reality of our relationships. I drove home through neighborhoods I'd grown to know well over the years, past the grocery store where I'd shopped for family dinners that Eli and Sophie rarely attended, past the park where I'd walked alone while Gregory was at work and his children were building their separate lives. The house looked the same as always, but everything felt different now. That evening, I called my friend Mara, who'd been practicing estate law for over 20 years. We'd known each other since college, and she was one of the few people who understood both my marriage to Gregory and my complicated relationship with his children. "So let me get this straight," Mara said after I'd explained the situation. "Gregory made you the trustee of an $800,000 fund without telling you about it?" "Apparently so. And his kids, who've barely spoken to you since the funeral, suddenly want to have lunch and talk about family." "That's about the size of it." Mara was quiet for a moment. I could hear her dog barking in the background and the sound of papers rustling on her desk. "Lorraine," she said finally, "you realize you have absolutely no obligation to approve early distribution, right? The trust was set up with specific age requirements for a reason." "But they're his children," I protested. "The money is meant for them eventually." Eventually being the key word. Gregory could have structured this differently if he'd wanted them to have immediate access. He could have left them the money directly in his will, or set up the trust with different age requirements. I'd been so focused on my shock at being named trustee that I hadn't really considered the implications of Gregory's choices. Why had he created such a complicated arrangement? Why involve me at all? "What do you think I should do?" I asked. "I think you should take your time," Mara said. "Get copies of all the trust documents, understand exactly what you're dealing with, and make a decision based on what you think is right, not what's convenient for everyone else." After we hung up, I went into Gregory's study and sat at his desk, Surrounded by the familiar smell of his cologne and the books he'd never finished reading, the mahogany filing cabinet in the corner was locked, and it took me 20 minutes to find the key in the back of his desk drawer. Inside the cabinet, I found folders full of financial documents, insurance policies, and investment statements. And there, in a folder labeled Trust Documents, was a complete copy of the fund Gregory had established for his children. Reading through the paperwork by the light of his desk lamp, I began to understand the complexity of what Gregory had created. The trust wasn't just about money. It included provisions for educational expenses, medical emergencies, and what the legal language termed character development considerations. There was a handwritten note paperclipped to the inside cover of the trust document, dated 3 years earlier. Lorraine, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and the kids are asking about the money. I know this puts you in a difficult position, and I'm sorry for that. But I've watched Eli make some questionable financial decisions, and Sophie has never had to work for anything she's received. I trust your judgment more than anyone's. Do what you think is right, not what's easy. Gregory. I read the note 3 times, feeling a complicated mix of love and frustration. Even in death, Gregory was asking me to be the responsible one, to make the hard decisions he'd avoided during his lifetime. But for the first time since I'd married him, I held real power in the family dynamic. The question was, what to do with it? The weeks following our lunch with Harold Brennan settled into an uneasy pattern. Eli called every few days, ostensibly, to check on how I was doing, but always managing to work the conversation around to the trust fund. Sophie visited twice, arriving with flowers and staying for dinner, chatting about her social media projects and upcoming marketing opportunities. It was the most attention either of them had paid me in 12 years, and I found their sudden interest both flattering and deeply suspicious. I wasn't naive enough to believe that Gregory's death had suddenly transformed me into the stepmother they'd always wanted. This newfound affection was clearly motivated by the $800,000 I controlled. You seem to be adjusting. Well, Sophie said during her second visit, as we cleaned up after dinner. She'd actually helped with the cooking this time, something she'd never done before, and had even complimented my pot roast. Some days are harder than others, I admitted. The house feels very quiet. I bet. It's so big for just one person. She paused in drying a dinner plate, as if struck by a sudden thought. Have you considered downsizing? I mean, this place must be a lot of work to maintain. There it was, the subtle suggestion that had been lurking beneath her newfound kindness. The house was indeed large for one person, and expensive to maintain, and probably worth more money than I'd ever need. If I sold it and moved somewhere smaller, I'd have liquid assets to invest or spend as I chose. I haven't really thought about it, I said, though that wasn't entirely true. I'd been thinking about it quite a lot, actually. Not because of the expense or the maintenance, but because living in Gregory's house sometimes felt like being trapped in someone else's life. Well, there's no rush, Sophie said quickly. I just meant that you have options, you know? Freedom to make your own choices. Now, the word freedom hung in the air between us, loaded with implications. Freedom to sell the house, freedom to move away, freedom to release the trust fund money and disappear from their lives entirely. It was a tempting offer in some ways. I could take Gregory's generous inheritance, find a small condo somewhere warm, and start over at 61 with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life. But something about Sophie's careful suggestions rankled me. The assumption that I'd naturally want to minimize my connection to their family, that I'd be eager to trade my role as trustee for a clean break, and no further obligations. I'm not in any hurry to make major changes, I told her. Your father just died. I think it's wise to take time before making big decisions, Sophie's smile faltered slightly. Of course. I didn't mean to suggest. I just want you to know that Eli and I want you to be happy, whatever that means for you. After she left, I stood in the kitchen where we'd shared dinner and conversation that felt almost genuine, wondering if I was being unfair. Maybe Sophie's concern was sincere. Maybe she really did want me to have freedom and happiness, and the trust fund was just a secondary consideration. But then I thought about the 12 years of polite distance, the family photos that somehow never included me, the holidays when I'd cooked elaborate meals for children who treated me like helpful staff. If Sophie wanted me to be happy now, where had that concern been when Gregory was alive? The next morning I drove to the bank where the trust fund was managed and asked to speak with Gregory's financial advisor. Janet Holbrook had been handling Gregory's investments for over 15 years, and she greeted me with the kind of professional sympathy that suggested she'd dealt with many widows in similar situations. I was sorry to hear about Gregory's passing, she said, settling behind her desk with a thick folder of documents. He was a careful investor and a good man. Thank you. I'm here because I'm trying to understand the trust fund he set up for his children. I've been named as trustee, and I want to make sure I understand my responsibilities. Janet walked me through the fund's performance over the past decade. Gregory had been conservative but smart with his investments, and the original $500,000 had grown to nearly $800,000 through careful management and regular contributions. He was very specific about the distribution terms, Janet explained. He felt strongly that his children should have some life experience before inheriting a substantial sum of money. Did he ever talk to you about making me the trustee? Several times, actually. He said he trusted your judgment and felt you understood the value of hard work. Janet paused, consulting her notes. He also mentioned that he was concerned about some financial decisions Eli had made in college. This was news to me. I'd never heard about any financial problems Eli had experienced, though I realized how little I actually knew about either of Gregory's children. Their lives had been carefully compartmentalized away from me, shared with their father in conversations I wasn't privy to. What kind of decisions? I asked. Janet hesitated, clearly weighing professional discretion against helpful information. Nothing catastrophic, she said finally. But he'd gotten involved in some high-risk investments, cryptocurrency, day trading, that sort of thing. Lost several $1,000s of his college fund money. Gregory had to bail him out his senior year. I thought about Eli's mention of investment opportunities and wondered if his request for early trust fund distribution was motivated by another financial mistake. How much did I really know about his current financial situation, beyond his steady job and nice apartment? And Sophie? I asked. Gregory never mentioned any specific concerns about Sophie's spending, but he did say she'd never had to earn money for herself. Everything had always been provided. College tuition, car payments, spending money. He wanted her to have a few years of independence before inheriting a large sum. The conversation with Janet gave me new perspective on Gregory's decision to name me as trustee. It wasn't just about convenience or family connection. It was about his genuine concern for his children's financial responsibility. He'd trusted me to make decisions that he couldn't bring himself to make directly. That afternoon, I called Mara and asked her to review the trust documents more carefully. I want to understand exactly what my obligations are. I told her, and what constitutes legitimate grounds for early distribution. Mara spent the weekend reviewing the paperwork and called me Sunday evening with her analysis. This is actually a very well-constructed trust, she said. Gregory clearly worked with someone who knew what they were doing. The language around early distribution is quite specific. It has to be for educational purposes, medical emergencies, or what's called significant life advancement opportunities. What does that last part mean? Things like starting a business, buying a first home, or other major life investments that would demonstrate financial responsibility. It's not meant for general living expenses or speculative investments. Based on Mara's analysis, neither Eli's vague investment opportunities nor Sophie's influencer marketing plans would qualify for early distribution. The trust was designed to prevent exactly those kinds of expenditures. Of course, Mara added, as trustee, you have some discretion in interpreting those terms. But you'd want to document your reasoning carefully, especially since there's so much money involved. Monday morning, I was in the garden pulling up the last of the summer vegetables when I saw a familiar car pull into the driveway. Beatriz Molina had worked as our housekeeper for the final 2 years of Gregory's life, coming twice a week to help with the heavy cleaning and laundry. She'd been one of the few people in the house who'd treated me with genuine warmth, and I'd grown to look forward to her visits. "Mrs. Lorraine," she called, getting out of her car with a covered casserole dish. "I brought you some enchiladas, my mother's recipe." Beatrice was in her 60s, with graying hair she kept in a neat bun and kind eyes that seemed to see everything. She'd been working for families in the area for over 30 years, and she had an intuitive understanding of household dynamics that came from observing people in their most unguarded moments. "That's so thoughtful," I said, pulling off my gardening gloves to accept the dish. "Would you like some coffee?" I was just about to take a break. We sat at the kitchen table where Sophie and I had shared dinner the week before, and I found myself telling Beatrice about the trust fund situation. She listened without comment, occasionally nodding or asking a clarifying question. "Mr. Gregory, he was a good man," she said when I'd finished explaining. "But sometimes good men make their women do the hard work they don't want to do themselves." It was such a succinct summary of my marriage that I almost laughed. Gregory had indeed been a good man, kind, responsible, faithful. But he'd also been conflict avoidant, preferring to smooth over problems rather than address them directly. Making me the trustee was typical of his approach. Let Lorraine handle the difficult decisions, while he remained the beloved father who never had to say no. "What do you think I should do?" I asked. Beatrice stirred sugar into her coffee, taking her time before answering. "I think you should remember that those children never treated you like family when their father was alive. People don't change just because they want something. But the money is meant for them eventually." "Eventually, yes. But Mr. Gregory, he put conditions on it for a reason. He could have given them the money directly if he wanted them to have it right away." Beatrice stayed for another hour, and we talked about everything except the trust fund. Her grandchildren, my garden, the changes in the neighborhood since Gregory's death. It was the kind of comfortable conversation I'd had so rarely in this house, and I realized how much I'd missed simple human connection. After she left, I spent the evening reading through the trust documents again, paying particular attention to Gregory's handwritten note. "Do what you think is right, not what's easy." It was both guidance and burden, asking me to make a judgment call about his children's character and readiness. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this decision wasn't really about the money. It was about whether Eli and Sophie had earned the right to inherit their father's legacy early, whether they demonstrated the maturity and responsibility that Gregory had wanted them to develop. In the 12 years I'd lived in this house, I'd watched them take Gregory's support for granted while treating me as an inconvenience to be tolerated. I'd seen them accept his financial help without gratitude, assume his presence without reciprocation, and plan their lives as if his love and resources would always be available without effort on their part. Now they needed something from me, and they were offering the same shallow charm they'd perfected with their father. Just enough warmth to get what they wanted, but not enough to suggest genuine relationship or respect. That night I made my decision. I wouldn't approve early distribution of the trust fund, at least not yet. Eli and Sophie could wait 2 more years for Sophie to turn 30, just as Gregory had originally intended. If they wanted the money earlier, they'd need to demonstrate the kind of emergency or opportunity that the trust was designed to support. But I also decided not to tell them my decision right away. Let them continue their campaign of sudden attention and manufactured affection. Let them reveal exactly how far they were willing to go to get what they wanted. I was curious to see what 12 years of politeness had been hiding now that the stakes had changed. For the first time since Gregory's death, I felt something approaching power in my own life. It wasn't a feeling I was used to, and I wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. But I was beginning to understand why Gregory had put me in this position. He'd given me the opportunity to finally matter in his family's story, even if he couldn't be there to see how it played out. The campaign began in earnest 2 weeks later. Eli started calling me twice a week, conversations that began with genuine-sounding inquiries about my health and gradually shifted toward discussions of financial planning and investment opportunities. Sophie increased her visits to every weekend, arriving with small gifts, a bouquet of flowers, my favorite bakery items, a scented candle that reminded her of me. It was masterfully orchestrated, this sudden flood of attention. They tag-teamed their efforts, with Eli taking a practical, business-like approach, while Sophie appealed to emotion and family connection. Neither mentioned the trust fund directly, but it hung in the air during every conversation like smoke from a hidden fire. "I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately," Sophie said during her 3rd consecutive weekend visit. We were sitting in the living room after dinner, and she was leafing through one of the photo albums Margaret had carefully maintained. "Look at this picture from my 16th birthday party. He looks so happy." The photo showed Gregory with his arm around a teenage Sophie, both of them grinning at the camera. In the background, I could see the elaborate decorations Sophie had insisted on. Purple and silver streamers, a 3-tier cake, dozens of balloons. I'd spent the entire day helping with preparations, while Sophie and her friends got ready upstairs, but I wasn't in any of the photos from the party itself. "He loved celebrating your milestones," I said, which was true. Gregory had been an attentive father, never missing a school play or soccer game, always ready to fund whatever activity or opportunity his children showed interest in. "I wish I'd appreciated it more at the time," Sophie said with a wistful sigh. "You know how teenagers are. You think your parents will always be there." It was the closest she'd come to acknowledging her own past behavior, and I felt a flicker of hope that maybe this conversation would be different from the others. "Knew you loved him," I told her. "Even when you were going through difficult phases." Sophie closed the photo album and turned to face me directly. "Can I ask you something? Do you think Dad was disappointed in me? I mean, with my career choice and everything?" The question caught me off guard. Sophie's social media influencer. Career had always seemed frivolous to me, but Gregory had been supportive, or at least publicly neutral about her choices. Why would you think that? I asked. I don't know. Sometimes I felt like he thought I wasn't serious enough about life. Like I needed to prove myself somehow, before he'd really respect me as an adult. It was a surprisingly insightful comment, and I wondered if Sophie had intuited more about the trust fund conditions than she'd let on. Did she understand that Gregory's decision to delay distribution was specifically about wanting his children to develop more maturity and life experience? Your father wanted you to be happy, I said carefully, but he also wanted you to understand the value of independence and hard work. Sophie nodded thoughtfully. That's why I've been working so hard on building my brand. I want to prove that I can support myself, you know? That I'm not just some privileged kid living off family money. The irony of this statement, given that she was currently campaigning for early access to family money, wasn't lost on me. But I could see genuine anxiety in Sophie's expression, a vulnerability I'd never witnessed before. What would proving yourself look like to you? I asked. I've got this amazing opportunity, Sophie said, her voice gaining energy and enthusiasm. There's a marketing agency that wants to partner with me on a major campaign. It would involve product placement deals, sponsored content, maybe even my own product line eventually. But I need upfront capital to hire a professional photographer, upgrade my equipment, and invest in inventory. She pulled out her phone and showed me a presentation she'd prepared. Professional-looking slides with revenue projections and market analysis. It was more thorough and businesslike than anything I'd expected from someone I'd dismissed as focused on superficial social media content. This is impressive, I admitted. How much upfront investment are we talking about? Ideally, about $100,000. I know that sounds like a lot, but the potential return is huge. And it's exactly the kind of business opportunity that Dad would have supported. I studied the presentation more carefully, noting the careful research and realistic projections. Sophie had clearly put significant thought and effort into this plan, and it addressed some of my concerns about her financial maturity and work ethic. Have you shown this to any banks or other potential investors? I asked. Sophie's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. A few. The problem is that I don't have enough established credit history or collateral. Most lenders want to see several years of steady income before they'll consider a loan this size. It was a legitimate obstacle, and one that traditional trust fund distribution was designed to address. This was exactly the kind of significant life advancement opportunity that Gregory's trust document had contemplated. But something about the timing still bothered me. Why hadn't Sophie mentioned this opportunity during our first conversation about the trust fund? Why present it now, weeks into her campaign of renewed attention, unless it was part of a calculated strategy to gain my approval? I'd like to think about this, I told her. Maybe have my financial advisor take a look at your business plan. Sophie's face lit up. Really? That would be amazing. I'm so grateful that you're even considering it. After Sophie left that evening, I called Mara to discuss the situation. It sounds like she's put together a legitimate business proposal, Mara said after I'd described Sophie's presentation. The question is whether you trust her motives and her ability to follow through. That's exactly what I can't figure out. Is this a genuine business opportunity that she's been working on independently, or something she put together specifically to justify accessing the trust fund? Does it matter? If the business plan is solid and represents a genuine growth opportunity, her motivation for developing it shouldn't necessarily disqualify her. Mara had a point. but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being manipulated. Sophie's sudden interest in spending time with me, her carefully timed revelations about wanting to prove herself, her professional presentation appearing just when she needed to justify early trust fund access. It all felt orchestrated. Meanwhile, Eli's approach was becoming more direct. He'd moved beyond vague mentions of investment opportunities and started sharing specific details about his financial situation. "I have to be honest with you, Lorraine," he said during one of our phone conversations. "I'm in a bit of a tight spot financially." He explained that he'd invested heavily in cryptocurrency during the pandemic, convinced that it was the future of finance. When the market crashed, he'd lost most of his savings and had been living on credit cards for the past several months. "I know it was stupid," he admitted. "Dad always warned me about high-risk investments, but I thought I was smarter than the market. Classic millennial overconfidence, right?" His self-deprecating honesty was disarming, and I found myself feeling sympathetic despite my suspicions about his motives. "How much are we talking about?" I asked. "About $40,000 in credit card debt, plus another $15,000 I borrowed from friends. I can make the minimum payments on my salary, but it's going to take years to dig out of this hole." Eli's financial troubles were exactly the kind of problem that traditional trust fund wisdom was designed to prevent. Young adults with access to large sums of money often made poor investment decisions, and Gregory had specifically structured the trust to avoid enabling such mistakes. But Eli was 30 years old now, not a college student. He'd learned a painful lesson about financial risk and seemed genuinely remorseful about his poor decisions. Was denying him access to his inheritance an appropriate consequence for his mistakes? Or was it punitive at this point? "I'm not asking for the full amount," Eli continued. "Even 60 or 70,000 would be enough to clear my debts and give me a fresh start. I've learned my lesson about speculative investing." The reasonable tone of his request made it harder to dismiss. But I couldn't forget Janet Holbrook's revelation that Gregory had already bailed Eli out of financial trouble once during college. Was this a pattern of poor decision-making, followed by requests for family money to fix the consequences? That weekend, Beatrice stopped by for coffee and noticed the business plan Sophie had left on the kitchen counter. "Miss Sophie is trying to start a business?" she asked, flipping through the presentation. "Something like that. She needs money to get started, and she's hoping I'll approve early distribution from the trust fund." Beatrice read through several pages carefully, her expression thoughtful. "This looks very professional. Did she make this herself?" "I assume so. Why?" "My nephew, Carlos. He works for a marketing company downtown. They make presentations like this for clients all the time." Beatrice paused, studying one of the slides more carefully. "These revenue numbers, they look very optimistic. Maybe too optimistic." "What do you mean?" "Carlos always says that when people want investors, they make the future look brighter than it probably will be. Real businesses take time to make money, especially in social media." Beatrice's observations echoed my own instincts about Sophie's presentation. It was impressive and professional, but perhaps too polished, too perfectly designed to address my concerns about Sophie's financial maturity. "What do you think I should do?" I asked. "I think you should remember that Mr. Gregory could have given them this money directly if he wanted them to have it now. He made you the trustee because he trusted your judgment, not because he wanted you to automatically say yes to everything they asked for." That evening, I sat in Gregory's study and read through his handwritten note again. "Do what you think is right, not what's easy. Approving both requests would certainly be the easy choice. It would make Eli and Sophie happy, end their financial pressure on me, and return our relationships to the polite distance we'd all grown accustomed to. But was it the right choice? Had either of them demonstrated the kind of growth and maturity that Gregory had hoped the trust fund delay would encourage? Or were they simply more sophisticated now in their requests for family money to solve problems of their own making? I thought about the 12 years I'd spent watching Gregory enable his children's dependence on his financial support. He'd paid for Eli's college expenses beyond what the scholarship covered, bought Sophie a car for her 16th birthday. Covered their insurance and phone bills well into their 20s. He'd been a generous father, but his generosity had never required accountability or growth from his children. Now they were asking me to continue that pattern, to provide a financial rescue without requiring them to fully experience the consequences of their choices. Eli wanted to be bailed out of investment losses, and Sophie wanted startup capital. For a business she'd never had to fund herself, neither request was unreasonable on its face, but both represented a continuation of the financial dependence that Gregory had apparently hoped the trust fund delay would help them overcome. I made my decision that night, sitting at Gregory's desk with his note in my hand. I would not approve early distribution for either Eli or Sophie. They could wait 2 more years, as Gregory had originally intended, and use that time to demonstrate their financial responsibility through their own efforts. Eli could dig himself out of his debt crisis using his salary and careful budgeting, proving to himself and others that he could recover from financial mistakes without family money. Sophie could pursue her business opportunity using traditional funding sources, building credit history and business experience that would serve her well beyond this single venture. It wouldn't be the easy choice, and it certainly wouldn't make me popular with Gregory's children, but it felt like the right choice, the one that honored both Gregory's intentions and my own assessment of what his children needed to become fully independent adults. The question now was how to communicate my decision, and how to handle the inevitable backlash when Eli and Sophie realized that their campaign of charm and attention had failed to achieve its intended result. I spent 3 sleepless nights rehearsing how I would tell Eli and Sophie about my decision. I practiced different explanations, trying to find words that would be firm but not harsh, clear but not cruel. I even wrote out a script of sorts, bullet points covering Gregory's intentions for the trust fund and my responsibilities as trustee. But I never had to use it. On Thursday morning, while cleaning out the last of Gregory's personal files from his bedroom dresser, I found an envelope tucked between old tax returns and insurance policies. My name was written on the outside in Gregory's careful handwriting, with a date from just 6 months before his death. Inside was a legal document I didn't recognize, a codicil to Gregory's will that apparently updated certain provisions of the trust fund. There was also another handwritten note, longer this time, written on Gregory's personal letterhead. "Lorraine," the note began. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and my children have approached you about the trust fund. By now you've probably discovered that I made you the trustee, and you're wrestling with decisions about early distribution. I need to tell you something that will change how you think about this situation." My hands were shaking as I continued, reading. "The trust fund contains money that isn't entirely mine. When Margaret died, she had a life insurance policy that paid out $500,000. The money was supposed to go directly to Eli and Sophie, but they were still teenagers, and I was concerned about them having access to such a large sum without proper guidance. I convinced them to let me invest the money on their behalf, promising that it would grow over time and be there when they really needed it. They agreed, trusting that I would manage it responsibly and distribute it when they were older. What they don't know is that I mixed Margaret's insurance money with my own investments to create the trust fund. About half of the money in that account, approximately $400,000, is technically their inheritance from their mother, not my bequest to them. I know this complicates your role as trustee tremendously. I know it's unfair to burden you with this knowledge after my death. But I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth while I was alive, and I couldn't bear the thought of them receiving such a large inheritance without having learned to value financial responsibility. The codicil attached to this note legally transfers the portion of the trust fund that represents Margaret's insurance payout directly to Eli and Sophie, effective immediately upon my death. They have a legal right to this money that supersedes any trustee authority. However, they can only claim it if they know it exists. The codicil was filed with Harold Brennan, but he was instructed not to mention it unless specifically asked about Margaret's insurance policy. I'm leaving this decision up to you, Lorraine. You can tell them about Margaret's money and let them claim it immediately. Or you can let them continue believing that the entire trust fund is subject to the age restrictions I established. Either choice is legally defensible. If you tell them about the insurance money, they'll have financial independence but won't have learned the lessons I hoped the trust fund delay would teach. If you don't tell them, they'll have to wait 2 more years, but will hopefully develop more maturity and financial responsibility in the meantime. This is an impossible position to put you in, and I'm sorry for that. But I trust your judgment more than anyone's, including my own. You've watched my children for 12 years. You know their strengths and weaknesses better than I was willing to admit to myself. Do what you think Margaret would have wanted for her children, not what's easiest or most convenient. I love you, and I'm grateful for everything you've given our family, even when we didn't deserve it. Gregory. I read the note 3 times before the full implications sank in. Eli and Sophie weren't just asking me to approve early distribution of their father's money. They were unknowingly asking me to decide whether they could access money that was legally already theirs. Margaret's life insurance payout had been sitting in that trust fund for over 10 years, growing and compounding, while her children waited for permission to access their own inheritance. Gregory had essentially stolen their money, however well-intentioned his motives might have been. The codicil was dated and notarized, clearly legal and binding. All I had to do was call Harold Brennan and ask about Margaret's insurance policy, and he would be obligated to inform Eli and Sophie about the codicil and their right to immediate distribution of their mother's money. But Gregory had deliberately structured things so that decision rested with me. He'd given me the power to reveal or conceal information that would fundamentally change his children's financial situation. I sat on the bedroom floor, surrounded by Gregory's papers, trying to process this revelation. Everything I thought I knew about the trust fund situation had been reframed in an instant. This wasn't about Gregory's careful estate planning or his concerns about his children's financial maturity. This was about a father who'd lied to his children about their inheritance from their mother. The ethical implications were staggering. Eli and Sophie had been waiting years for money that was already legally theirs, making financial decisions based on the assumption that they couldn't access their inheritance until Sophie turned 30. Eli's debt problems, Sophie's business, financing challenges, both could be resolved immediately with money that belonged to them. But there was another layer to consider. If I revealed the truth about Margaret's insurance money, I would also be revealing that Gregory had been fundamentally dishonest with his children about something crucial. It would change how they remembered their father, potentially destroying their idealized image of him as a loving, trustworthy parent. Was that my decision to make? Did I have the right to shatter their memories of Gregory in order to give them access to money they didn't even know they were entitled to. I called Mara, immediately reading Gregory's note over the phone and explaining the codicil. "Jesus, Lorraine," Mara said when I'd finished. "This is incredibly complicated. Legally, the kids have a right to know about the codicil. Ethically, Gregory put you in an impossible position." "What would you do?" "I honestly don't know. The money is rightfully theirs, but revealing it means exposing Gregory's deception. There's no clean choice here." Mara offered to review the codicil and research the legal precedents for similar situations, but she warned me that the law might not provide clear guidance for this kind of ethical dilemma. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery where Gregory and Margaret were buried. I'd visited Gregory's grave several times since the funeral, but I'd never spent much time at Margaret's headstone. It felt strange and intrusive, paying respects to a woman I'd never met, but whose shadow had dominated my entire marriage. Margaret Whitaker, beloved wife and mother, 1962-2009. The inscription was simple, surrounded by flowers that someone, probably Sophie, had placed there recently. I sat on the grass between their graves, trying to imagine what Margaret would have wanted for her children. Would she have approved of Gregory's decision to delay their inheritance in the name of teaching financial responsibility? Or would she have been furious that he'd kept their money from them under false pretenses? From everything I'd learned about Margaret over the years, she'd been practical and direct, less inclined toward Gregory's conflict avoidance strategies. She probably would have found a way to give her children their inheritance while also teaching them responsibility rather than resorting to deception and manipulation. But Margaret wasn't here to make that choice. Gregory had left the decision to me, the stepmother who'd never quite found her place in the family dynamic, who'd spent 12 years being politely excluded from important conversations and decisions. Now, suddenly, I held the power to determine not just Eli and Sophie's financial future, but their understanding of their father's character and their mother's legacy. It was a crushing responsibility, one I'd never asked for and didn't feel qualified to handle. That evening, Sophie called to ask if she could come over for dinner on Saturday. "I've been thinking about our conversation last weekend," she said, "about the business opportunity and proving myself to Dad. I wanted to talk to you about something." Her voice held an excitement that made me wonder if she'd developed new arguments for accessing the trust fund, or perhaps found other potential investors for her business plan. "Of course," I said. "I'll make that chicken dish you liked last time." After we hung up, I realized that Sophie's visit would force me to make a decision about revealing Margaret's insurance money. I could continue the charade of deliberating about trust fund distribution while knowing that Eli and Sophie already had legal access to half the money. Or I could tell them the truth and deal with the consequences. I spent Friday evening reading and rereading Gregory's note, trying to decipher his true intentions. Had he genuinely believed that keeping Margaret's insurance money in the trust fund was in his children's best interests? Or had he simply been unable to face the difficult conversations that would come with being honest about their inheritance? The more I thought about it, the more Gregory's decision seemed like a continuation of the conflict avoidance that had characterized our entire marriage. Rather than having honest discussions with Eli and Sophie about financial responsibility and the risks of inheriting money too young, he'd simply hidden their inheritance and created elaborate legal structures to justify the delay. He'd also burdened me with cleaning up the mess, just as he'd burdened me with managing the difficult emotional dynamics in our household while he remained the beloved father who never had to say no. But this time, his avoidance strategy had backfired. By making me the trustee and leaving me the note about Margaret's insurance money, Gregory had given me more power over his children's lives than I'd ever had while he was alive. The question was whether I would use that power to continue his deception or to finally tell the truth he'd been too cowardly to share. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 12 years, Eli and Sophie had treated me as irrelevant to their family's important decisions. Now I literally held the key to their financial future and their understanding of their father's character. The stepmother they'd dismissed and ignored was about to determine the most significant revelation of their adult lives. Saturday morning, I made my choice. I would tell Sophie the truth about Margaret's insurance money when she came for dinner. I would show her Gregory's note in the codicil, explain her legal rights, and let her decide what to do with the information. It wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't be clean, but it would be honest, which was more than Gregory had managed in 10 years of managing his children's inheritance. The truth, I realized, was its own form of justice. Saturday arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of October day that made the house feel smaller and more intimate. I spent the morning preparing Sophie's favorite dinner, herb-crusted chicken with roasted vegetables, and the apple crumble I'd perfected over years of trying to win her approval. The irony of making such an effort for what might be our last civil conversation wasn't lost on me. Gregory's note and the codicil sat in a manila envelope on his desk like a loaded gun. Every time I passed the study, I hesitated. Was I ready to shatter the fragile peace Sophie and I had built this past month? I kept thinking about Margaret's grave, about the inscription calling her a beloved mother. She'd arranged the life insurance policy to provide for her children, but Gregory had turned it into a tool of control. Sophie arrived at 3, carrying a bottle of wine, and wearing the casual elegance she'd perfected online. She looked beautiful and confident, but tension lingered around her eyes. "Something smells amazing," she said. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "I wanted to," I said. "Whatever happened tonight, I wanted it to be a good memory." We chatted for an hour. Her social media work, my garden, a dating story about her friend. It felt easy, almost like family. Over dinner, she grew more serious. "I've been thinking about Dad, about what he wanted for Eli and me." "He wanted you to be happy," I said, "but also independent." "I know. That's why I've been working on my business plan. I want to succeed on my own, not with trust fund money." She paused. "I think I've been going about this all wrong, asking for an early distribution. That's exactly what Dad didn't want. I need to prove I can do this myself." I looked up, surprised. She was withdrawing her request, demonstrating the kind of maturity Gregory had hoped for. "I've been talking to other investors, people in the influencer space. One of them might be willing to partner with me." She was excited, thoughtful, and it made what I had to tell her even harder. "Sophie," I said, setting my fork down, "there's something you don't know about the trust fund." Her smile faded. "Is there a problem?" "Not a problem exactly, but your father kept something from you and Eli. Something that changes everything." I retrieved the envelope from the study, hands trembling, and placed it on the table. Sophie read Gregory's note first, her expression shifting from confusion to anger. "He lied to us," she said, "about Mom's money. He's been lying for 10 years. "Yes. $400,000 of that trust fund was Mom's life insurance money. We could have had it years ago. According to the codicil, yes." She read the document, her hands shaking. "Why didn't Harold tell us during the will reading?" "Because Gregory told him not to mention it. unless you specifically asked about Margaret's policy. Which we wouldn't do, because we assumed Dad would tell us if there was anything. Her voice was rising. He manipulated us into thinking we needed his permission to access our own money. I nodded, unable to speak. Does Eli know? Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first. She stood abruptly and walked to the window. I can't believe this. All those years of student loans, struggling with rent, and Mom had already provided for us. Sophie. And how long have you known? I found the note Thursday morning. I've been trying to decide what to do. Decide what to do? It's our money, Lorraine. The way she said my name stung. The warmth we'd built was gone. Your father asked me to make a judgment call, I said, about whether you and Eli were ready. She laughed bitterly. I'm 28, Lorraine. I have a degree, a business plan, no criminal record. What more do I need to prove? She was right. The idea of financial readiness seemed irrelevant now. You're right. I'm sorry. It's not my decision to make. No, it's not. And it wasn't Dad's either. Mom chose to provide for us, and he had no right to override that. I thought of Margaret, the woman I never met, and how she'd tried to care for her children, even in death. Gregory had rewritten her intentions. What are you going to do? I asked. Call Harold Brennan on Monday. Then call Eli. He deserves to know what our father really thought of us. Sophie, I know you're angry. Angry doesn't. Cover it! She was gathering her coat. Do you know what hurts most? It's not even the money. It's the lying. It's Dad treating us like children. She paused at the door, her voice low and cutting. And it's you sitting on this, deciding whether we were worthy of knowing the truth, just like Dad. The accusation hit hard. I had tried to weigh everything, to do what was right, but I'd still chosen silence, at least for a while. I was trying to honor your father's wishes. Well, your judgment was wrong. She left without a goodbye, the car pulling out fast. I stood at the window watching her go, knowing I'd likely lost any chance at a real relationship with her. But I also knew I'd done the right thing. Margaret's money belonged to her children. They had a right to it, even if the truth hurt. Later, I cleaned the dishes in silence and thought about calling Eli. Sophie would tell him soon, but I wanted him to hear from me too. First, though, I'd call Harold Brennan to make sure he'd honor the codicil immediately. No delays, no complications. The house was quiet, quieter than it had been since Gregory died. For a brief time it had felt alive, with visits and calls, with hope for something like family. Now it returned to stillness, but this time was different. I wasn't the silent stepmother anymore. I'd made a choice that mattered, that would change Sophie and Eli's lives. Not the choice Gregory wanted, not the one that kept the peace, but the one that told the truth. Margaret's jewelry box still sat on the dresser upstairs, playing her wedding song. Tomorrow her children would finally receive the inheritance she intended. It was a small victory, and a costly one. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the conversation with Sophie, wondering if I could have handled it differently, if there had been a way to reveal the truth without destroying whatever progress we'd made toward understanding each other. At 6:30 in the morning, my phone rang. Eli's name appeared on the screen, and I knew Sophie had already called him. Lorraine. His voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the anger underneath. Sophie told me about the insurance money, about Dad's note. I'm sorry you had to learn about it this way. Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been playing games with information that belonged to us. The accusation stung, but I understood his anger. From Eli and Sophie's perspective, I'd become another adult who'd decided what they needed to know about their own lives. I was trying to figure out the right thing to do, I said. Your father put me in an impossible position. No, he didn't. The right thing was to tell us immediately. The money is ours, Lorraine. It's been ours for 10 years. Eli was right, and I didn't have a good defense for my delay in revealing the information. I'd been so focused on Gregory's concerns about his children's financial responsibility that I'd lost sight of their fundamental right to know about their inheritance. You're absolutely right, I said. I should have told you both immediately. The admission seemed to deflate some of Eli's anger. Look, I know Dad put you in a difficult situation, but this isn't just about the money. It's about trust and honesty and being treated like adults. I understand. What are you going to do? Sophie and I are meeting with Harold Brennan this morning. We're going to claim the insurance money and find out exactly what other information Dad might have kept from us. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen drinking coffee and thinking about Harold's reaction when Eli and Sophie showed up demanding answers about Margaret's insurance policy. He'd probably been dreading this conversation for years, knowing that Gregory's deception would eventually come to light. I was surprised when my doorbell rang at 9 o'clock. Through the front window, I could see Eli's car in the driveway, and my heart rate picked up as I wondered what new revelation or confrontation this visit might bring. But when I opened the door, I found both Eli and Sophie standing on the front porch, their expressions serious but not hostile. We need to talk, Sophie said. All of us together. I led them into the living room, the same space where we'd shared awkward conversations after Gregory's funeral, where I'd watched them calculate their next moves in the campaign for Hurley Trust Fund distribution. But the dynamic felt different now. More honest, if less comfortable. We saw Harold this morning, Eli began. He confirmed everything in Dad's note. The codicil is legitimate, and we have immediate legal access to Mom's insurance money. That's good, I said, though I wasn't sure how to read their mood. But Harold also told us something else, Sophie continued. Something that wasn't in Dad's note. My stomach dropped. What other secrets had Gregory been keeping? Apparently, Dad updated the trust fund documents multiple times over the years, Eli said. The original version named Mom as the trustee, with Dad as backup. After Mom died, he updated it to name himself as primary trustee. I knew that part, but what you probably don't know is that he updated it again 5 years ago, when you became the trustee. And at that point, he also changed the distribution terms. Fi pulled out a folder of documents from Harold's office. In the original version, Eli and I were supposed to receive the money when we both turned 25. Dad changed it to 30 when he made you the trustee. I stared at the papers, trying to process this new information. Gregory had not only hidden Margaret's insurance money from his children, but he'd also extended the delay for accessing his own contributions to the trust fund. Why would he do that? I asked. Harold thinks it was because of some financial mistakes I made in college, Eli said. Apparently, Dad was more worried about my judgment than he ever let on. But changing the age requirement affected both of us, Sophie added. I never made any financial mistakes. I was being punished for Eli's poor decisions. The unfairness of Gregory's approach was becoming clearer. Rather than having direct conversations with his children about money management and responsibility, he'd used legal mechanisms to extend their dependence without their knowledge or consent. There's something else, Eli said. Harold showed us the correspondence between Dad and the lawyers who drafted these documents. Dad was very specific about wanting to use the trust fund to teach us lessons about patience and financial responsibility. Sophie's expression darkened. He literally told the lawyers that he wanted us to prove ourselves worthy of our inheritance, like we were medieval peasants seeking favor from the lord of the manor. The more I learned about Gregory's approach to the trust fund, the more manipulative it seemed. He'd created elaborate legal structures to avoid having honest conversations with his children, then burdened me with implementing his deceptive strategy. "But here's the thing we can't figure out," Eli said, leaning forward in his chair. "Harold said Dad talked to him extensively about making you the trustee. It wasn't a casual decision or an oversight. Dad specifically wanted you in that role." "Why?" Sophie asked. "No offense, but you barely knew us, and we certainly didn't have a close relationship. Why would Dad trust you with such a huge decision about our financial future?" It was a fair question, one I'd been wondering about myself. Gregory had never discussed his reasoning with me, never prepared me for the responsibility he was placing on my shoulders. "I think," I said slowly, "your father knew that he'd created an unsustainable situation. He'd lied to you about your mother's money, and he'd extended the trust fund delay without telling you. Eventually, the truth was going to come out." I paused, trying to articulate thoughts that were still forming in my mind. I think he wanted someone outside the family to be the one to reveal the truth, someone who wouldn't be protected by your love and respect the way he was. Eli and Sophie exchanged glances, considering this possibility. "You think he set you up to be the bad guy?" Sophie asked. "I think he set me up to make choices he couldn't make himself, including the choice to tell you about your mother's insurance money." The room fell quiet as we all contemplated the implications of Gregory's strategy. He'd engineered a situation where his own deception would be revealed by someone else, preserving his image as a loving father while ensuring that his children would eventually learn the truth. "That's incredibly manipulative," Eli said finally. "It is," I agreed. "But it's also very much in character for your father. He hated confrontation, especially with people he loved." Sophie stood up and walked to the mantelpiece, where family photos chronicled decades of Whitaker family history. She picked up a picture of herself with Gregory at her high school graduation, both of them smiling broadly. "I keep looking at these photos and wondering how much of it was real," she said. "Was Dad genuinely proud of us? Or was he always calculating what lessons we needed to learn?" "He was genuinely proud of you," I said, without hesitation. "His love for you and Eli was never in question. His methods were problematic, but his intentions came from a place of caring. Caring." Sophie's voice rose. "He stole our inheritance and lied to us for years. How is that caring?" "Because he was terrified of you making the same mistakes he'd watched other wealthy families make. He'd seen trust fund kids who never learned to work, who burned through fortunes without understanding their value. He wanted better for you." "But that wasn't his choice to make," Eli said. "Mom left us that money. She trusted us to handle it responsibly, even as teenagers. Dad overruled her judgment. He was right, and I didn't have a good defense for Gregory's decision to redirect Margaret's insurance payout. Whatever his concerns about his children's financial readiness, he'd had no right to override their mother's final gift. "So, what happens now?" I asked. "Now we claim Mom's money and try to figure out how to rebuild trust in our family," Sophie said, "which, unfortunately, includes you." The comment surprised me. "Me?" "Like it or not, you're part of this family's story now," Eli said. "Dad made sure of that when he appointed you as trustee. You know things about our family that we didn't know ourselves." And you made the choice to tell us the truth, even though it was painful," Sophie added. "That matters." I felt tears forming. In my eyes, overwhelmed by their unexpected grace in the face of such a difficult revelation. "I know we haven't been fair to you over the years," Eli continued. "We treated you like an outsider because it was easier than accepting that Dad had moved on after Mom's death. But you've been dealing with his complicated decisions and protecting our interests, even when we didn't appreciate it." Sophie returned. To her seat, her expression softer than it had been since she'd arrived. "The truth is, we need to stick together to figure out Dad's legacy. There might be other things we don't know about, other decisions he made that affect all of us." "What do you mean?" "Harold suggested we do a complete review of Dad's estate and business affairs," Eli explained. "Make sure there aren't any other surprises waiting for us." The prospect of more revelations was daunting, but also oddly comforting. For the first time since Gregory's death, Eli and Sophie were including me in their plans, treating me as a partner rather than an obstacle. "I'd like that," I said. "I'd like to understand what your father was thinking, and why he made the choices he did." "It won't be easy," Sophie warned. "We're probably going to discover things that change how we remember him." "Maybe," I said, "but at least we'll be discovering them together." It wasn't the reconciliation I'd hoped for, and it wasn't the family relationship I'd dreamed of during my marriage to Gregory. But it was honest, and it was real, and it was built on a foundation of truth rather than polite fiction. For the first time in 12 years, I felt like I actually belonged in the Whitaker family story. 6 months later, I was sitting in my newly renovated kitchen, watching spring rain streak the windows I'd finally been allowed to replace. The house still bore Gregory's structure, but now it reflected my choices. The cream-colored sofa had been swapped for a warm blue sectional. Margaret's formal dining room had become my art studio, where easels stood in place of her untouched crystal cabinets. The changes weren't just aesthetic. After months of sifting through Gregory's financial affairs with Eli and Sophie, we'd uncovered just how much control he'd exercised, redirecting Margaret's insurance, setting up education funds, making donations in the family's name, even managing properties Sophie hadn't known she owned. He wasn't just controlling our money, Sophie had said over one of our weekly dinners. He was controlling our entire understanding of our family's finances. Yet buried in the manipulations was genuine concern. Gregory had made these decisions to ensure his children's long-term security, albeit through methods they found paternalistic and deceptive. Eli had used some of the insurance money to clear his debts and rebuild with help from a conservative financial advisor. The near collapse of his finances had taught him more than any delayed trust fund could. Sophie, meanwhile, used a portion of her inheritance to boost her influencer business. Now she was respected for authentic, thoughtful content. And she was proud of having built something herself. "I'm glad I didn't get the money when I was 25, she told me. "I would have wasted it chasing a lifestyle instead of building a future." Learning the truth about Gregory had hurt, but it had also released them from the burden of idealizing him. They could now see him clearly, a loving, flawed man who made complicated choices with complicated motives. My bond with Eli and Sophie had transformed into something genuine, family forged through shared experience. Together, we'd navigated Gregory's legacy, made decisions about donations and property, and learned to trust each other's judgment. "You know what's funny?" Eli had said during a meeting with Harold Brennan. "We learned more about money management from working with Lorraine than from anything Dad ever did." It was true. Untangling Gregory's estate forced us to research investments, evaluate policies, and collaborate in ways that felt empowering rather than punitive. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Sophie stood on the porch, holding a covered dish and a bottle of wine. "Thai food," she announced, pushing past me into the kitchen. "From that place you've been dying to try." These surprise visits had become routine. Sometimes Sophie with takeout, sometimes Eli with updates. They visited because they wanted to, not out of duty. Over dinner, Sophie shared updates on her latest campaign, a partnership with a financial literacy organization inspired by our trust fund ordeal. "I want to help people avoid making decisions from ignorance," she said. She paused, fork poised over her pad thai. "Eli's bringing someone to dinner next Sunday. Her name's Jennifer. She's a high school math teacher." The idea of Eli bringing someone to our Sunday dinner felt momentous. Sophie noticed my expression. "Are you ready for that?" she asked. "Another woman in the family dynamic." I smiled. "I think so. It'll be interesting to see how we navigate it." "It can't be more awkward than dinners with Dad," she laughed. "Remember all that polite pretending?" I did. Back then, conversation was strained and guarded. Now, our dinners were filled with real talk about Sophie's business, Eli's career, my own musings about teaching again. Even our disagreements felt constructive. "I've been thinking," Sophie said, "about the house and your plans." My stomach tensed. I sometimes feared they resented me for inheriting it. "What about it?" "You should do whatever feels right. Stay, sell, renovate, whatever makes you happy. It's your house now, not Dad's." I didn't need their permission, but hearing it meant more than any legal document. "Actually," I said, "I'm thinking of turning the basement into a real studio, maybe teaching private lessons upstairs." "That sounds amazing," she said, beaming. After she left, I walked the house, imagining how each room might better reflect me. Not Gregory or Margaret. It had been someone else's museum long enough. The next morning, I visited the cemetery as I did monthly, laying tulips on Margaret and Gregory's graves. I'd begun bringing flowers for both, honoring Margaret's part in the family I'd come to know. As I arranged the blooms, I thought about the house, about what home meant now. The Whitaker house would never feel like it had for Gregory or his children, but it was becoming something else, an honest space, a place of rebuilding. I realized, standing among the headstones, that I'd found my place in their story, not as a stepmother trying to replace Margaret, or a tolerated outsider, but as someone who had helped Eli and Sophie reclaim their inheritance and their understanding of love and legacy. It wasn't the family I dreamed of when I married. Gregory, but it was real, earned through truth and shared experience. My phone buzzed. A text from Eli. "Dinner Sunday at 6? Jennifer's excited to meet you," I replied. "Looking forward to it. I'll make my famous apple crumble." Driving home, I pictured introducing Jennifer to our new, honest version of the family. We'd tell the truth about Gregory, the good and the bad, because honesty, I'd learned, was the only real foundation for connection. The house looked warm and alive as I pulled into the driveway, the windows glowing with sunlight and the garden beginning to bloom again. Once the place where I'd felt invisible, it was now where I'd claimed my role. Inside, I retrieved the envelope containing Gregory's note about Margaret's insurance. I'd kept it as a symbol of the turning point. When I'd chosen truth over comfort, it had been the right decision. Difficult, but right. That truth had cost me the ease of superficial relationships, but had earned something richer: respect, understanding, family. Gregory had been right in one way. I was the right person to manage his children's inheritance, not because I was perfect, but because I stood outside the illusions and could tell the truths no one else could. The afternoon light dimmed as I settled into my art studio, surrounded by work that was more abstract, more emotional, more me. These weren't the tidy pieces I once painted. They were honest, like the life I'd built. In one painting, I'd tried to capture the feeling of standing between Gregory and Margaret's graves, honoring both their memory and their children's right to understand their inheritance. In another, I'd painted the kitchen table where Sophie and I had shared so many difficult conversations, where truth had finally been told after years of polite evasion. These paintings would never hang in galleries or win awards, but they mattered to me because they represented my own story, my own journey, from invisible stepmother to integral family member. They were evidence of a voice I'd almost lost during my marriage to Gregory, but had somehow managed to reclaim when it mattered most. Sunday dinner with Eli, Sophie, and Jennifer was lovely. Jennifer was smart and funny, with an easy laugh and genuine interest in our family story. She asked thoughtful questions about Gregory's real estate business and Sophie's social media career, and she seemed genuinely charmed by the complicated dynamics we'd learned to navigate. "It's really amazing how you've all worked through such a difficult situation," she told me as we cleaned up after dinner. "Eli talks about you with such respect and affection." "We've come a long way," I said, watching Eli and Sophie argue good-naturedly about whose turn it was to load the dishwasher. It wasn't always like this. "The best families are the ones that choose to keep working at it," Jennifer said. "Even when it's hard." Later, after everyone had gone home, I sat in the living room where we'd shared our first awkward conversation about the trust fund, where secrets had been revealed and relationships had been rebuilt. The room looked the same as it had during Gregory's lifetime, but everything about our family dynamic had been transformed. I'd started my marriage to Gregory, hoping to become the kind of stepmother who would be seamlessly integrated into his children's lives, who would be loved and appreciated for the care I provided. That had never happened, and for years I'd considered it a failure of my own making. But I'd become something different and perhaps more valuable. The family member willing to tell difficult truths, to make hard decisions, to prioritize the honesty over harmony. It wasn't the role I'd auditioned for, but it was the role the family had needed. Margaret's jewelry box still sat on the dresser upstairs, still played the wedding song from her marriage to Gregory. But now it also held the key to the safety deposit box, where I kept important family documents, including the trust fund papers and Gregory's handwritten notes. Past and present, tradition and transformation, all contained in the same small space. The money that had caused so much complexity and pain had ultimately brought us together, not because of its dollar value, but because of the conversations it had forced us to have, the truths it had compelled us to tell, the relationships it had challenged us to rebuild on more honest foundations. In the end, Gregory's trust fund strategy had worked, just not in the way he'd intended. Instead of teaching his children patience and financial responsibility through legal mechanisms and delayed distribution, it had taught all of us about the importance of truth-telling and genuine communication. We'd learned that love without honesty is incomplete, that family relationships require more than shared DNA or legal connections, that real trust has to be earned through consistency and transparency rather than demanded through authority or tradition. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed, I felt grateful for the complicated journey that had brought us to this point. It hadn't been the family story I'd expected to be part of, but it had been worth the pain and uncertainty to finally find my place in it. The woman who'd been invisible for 12 years had finally learned to be seen, to matter, to shape the narrative rather than simply endure it. The stepchildren who'd ignored me for years had become the family I'd always hoped for. Not despite our difficulties, but because of how we'd chosen to work through them together. Tomorrow I would start planning the renovations to turn the basement into a proper art studio. Next week, Eli and Sophie and I would meet with the financial advisor to review the quarterly reports on our family investments. Next month, we'd gather for Sophie's birthday dinner, a celebration that would include Jennifer and possibly other new family members we hadn't met yet. The future felt open and full of possibility in a way it hadn't since before Gregory's diagnosis, not because the pain of loss had disappeared, but because we'd learned to build something meaningful from the complicated legacy he'd left behind. I'd never be Margaret, would never be the mother Eli and Sophie had lost or the wife Gregory had loved first. But I was Lorraine, the woman who'd chosen truth over convenience, honesty over harmony, real relationship over polite fiction. And that, finally, was enough. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.